Hello, and welcome to the presentation of Endurance, Sports, and Recovery. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Kurtz, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you some powerful information regarding this important topic. A little bit about myself. I'm a doctor of chiropractic and graduated from the National College of Chiropractic in 2002. I'm a certified chiropractic sports physician, and I am a diplomate and teacher of the International College of Applied Kinesiology. I'm currently based in Munich, Germany, and will be soon relocating to the U.S. I have several years of experience working with Ironman athletes and coaches in my practice in Chicago. I worked with Europe's top athletes for 4 years at the European Regionals CrossFit Games. And I have worked with the Munich Cowboys for the last 8 seasons, which is a professional American football team in the German Football League. So today's topics. Why is recovery important? Well, we all know that we need to recover, and recovery is an important aspect to increasing athletic performance, to building muscle, to building endurance, to improving your stamina, to simply healing from injuries. Now, in order to understand recovery, it is important to understand the basics involved with optimal function during sport. By optimizing physiology and therefore performance, recovery becomes less complicated. So basically, if you build your body up to perform its best, then the recovery becomes less complicated. If you are taking a body that's not so strong, for example, into a competition, then you're gonna push it and possibly injure it, but the performance won't be as good. And the other thing is that you're gonna break down your body more, and recovery is gonna take longer, and it's gonna be less efficient. So it's important to know how to prepare for events, what to do after in order to maximize the efficiency of recovery. So with this seminar, you're going to learn energy systems and their nutrition requirements, the role of macronutrients in nutrition, hormonal systems and the nutritive factors involved, nutrition therapy using supplements and their absorption, which is very important. And then at the end, I'm going to summarize everything with some micronutrient recommendations. So the first energy system is the aerobic system. Aerobic exercise is a long-lasting activity requiring more fat as an energy source. It involves type 1 muscle fibers. There are 2 muscle fiber types. There's type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is known as the slow twitch and uses fatty acids for energy, and type 2 is the fast twitch and uses more glucose or sugar for its energy source. Now, fatty acid utilization is dependent upon the intensity of the activity. So if you have lower to moderate intensity, your body's gonna use more fat for energy. If you have higher intensity, then it's going to use sugar. Now, Vukovic et al. Found that increased dietary fat intake saves glycogen during exercise. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose and is located in the muscles and in the liver. And during the first few seconds of exercise or activity, high intensity activity, your muscles will use that little storage of glycogen for its energy source before it turns to blood sugar. So, now, we've all heard of carb loading before a long endurance event, and it's quite dated, but yeah, the research has said before that, okay, if we eat a bunch of carbs, we'll have lots of energy for the event. And the thing is that Foster et al. Found that high-dose glucose, 30 to 45 minutes before exercise, increases the use of glucose for fuel and decreases fatty acid use. So actually, carb loading would be good, for example, before a high intensity event, but not necessarily for a long endurance event. Because your result is you get a decrease in exercise time before reaching exhaustion, and your body has trouble switching from sugar as a fuel source to fatty acids as a fuel source. That's an important idea to grasp. Now, in the anaerobic energy system, we have short bursts of activity. We use mostly glucose as an energy source. And glycolysis is the main biochemical pathway. Glycolysis is a biochemical pathway that produces pyruvate. It basically converts glucose into energy. And a byproduct of that energy production is lactic acid. ATP is known as the main energy molecule. It's adenyl triphosphate. Glycolysis and Krebs cycle together produce about 36 ATP. And that uses glucose as its main energy source. But then beta oxidation, which uses fatty acids as its energy source, produces 4 times that amount, almost 4 times that amount. So it's pretty amazing, the difference and the efficiency of fatty acid utilization compared with that of glucose utilization. Now, metabolism and energy from macronutrients. Yeah, any dysfunction in these systems will result in decreased energy production, naturally, fatigue, depression, decreased performance, and injury. Now, stress and nutritional deficiencies can contribute to these dysfunctions. And that is important to realize that stress is huge when it comes to hormone control, insulin control, and energy production as a whole. So with chronic stress, it's going to be harder to be efficient in your energy production and therefore in your performance. Now, the three main macros are carbohydrates, fatty acids, and protein. All three can be converted into energy. And so carbohydrates, basically it's glucose used in glycolysis and Krebs cycle. Fatty acids through beta oxidation and glycolysis produce energy. Proteins, which play a smaller role in energy production, are basically broken down into amino acids and converted to glucose through gluconeogenesis. Now, the calorie output of nutrients, this is an important point. Fat produces 9 calories per gram, carbohydrates and protein produce 4 calories per gram. So you're getting more than double the energy output from 1 gram of fat compared to that of carbohydrates and proteins. So now cofactors or micronutrients needed or that are important with energy production, specifically glycolysis and Krebs cycle, which is carbohydrate metabolism for the most part, are B vitamins and magnesium, manganese, and iron. Okay, lactic acid, I talked about a minute ago, that's a byproduct of glycolysis, and it's basically at low to moderate intensity exercise, it's going to be recycled in the liver into pyruvate. If you look to the right in the visual, you'll see pyruvate in the middle there. And pyruvate can be converted to lactate, which is lactic acid, or it can be sent into the Krebs cycle through acetyl-CoA there if you go downwards. Now, lactate can also then be converted back to pyruvate, which then goes upwards in the reaction towards glucose and ends up making glucose. Now, in low to moderate exercise, the removal of lactate equals that of its production. So you get basically a net zero effect. Now, if in high intensity exercise, you get high lactate production, and therefore your production exceeds that of the rate of removal, and it starts to build up in your muscles. And when it builds up in your muscles, it tends to lower the pH. The pH, a lower pH is more acidic, and therefore it's harder to contract the muscles. Contractibility decreases. And so that's when you start to feel the burn, and the more it starts to build up and more it starts to burn, it gets harder and harder to contract that muscle, and it gets harder to, well, keep going at the same rate. Now, Aitken and Thompson found that high carb diets increased lactic acid production and low carb diets decreased lactic acid production. So we talked about earlier, there was somebody who found that higher dietary fat intake would preserve your glycogen stores in your muscles. And then also here with a low carb intake, then you get decreased lactic acid production. So the two together can really contribute to better muscle function, more efficient muscle function using fatty acids. And then also with decreased lactic acid production, you get less of a decrease in pH in the muscle, and therefore you can contract the muscle longer. And that, of course, increases performance. So now fat metabolism for energy uses beta oxidation. The process is dependent on mitochondrial function. And what is a mitochondria? Mitochondria is an organelle in the cell that basically it's nicknamed the powerhouse of the cell because it produces all the energy for the cell. Now, the three factors involved with the efficiency of beta oxidation or the breakdown of fatty acids for energy is muscle fiber function, specifically type 1, which is the slow twitch, and that uses fatty acids for energy. The mitochondria function, of course, is critical. And then fatty acid transport in the blood. If you don't have good circulation, then the fatty acid, which is the fuel source, cannot get into the engine, which is the mitochondria. And therefore your energy production becomes less efficient. So protein metabolism plays a smaller role in energy production, but yet it still is important. Protein is broken down into amino acids and then converted to glucose in the liver through gluconeogenesis. This requires a sufficient B3 or niacin supply, so B vitamins, we're gonna see a repeating theme here where B vitamins are really important in overall energy production, whether it's carbohydrate or fatty acid utilization for fuel. Decreased protein supply can lead to fatigue, especially during the day, and the body will borrow from Peter to pay Paul. What does that mean? That means basically we need amino acids to survive and to run critical body processes. If we have either too little protein in the diet, or our absorption, our digestion and absorption of protein is insufficient, we're going to end up with a protein deficiency overall. And what the body will then do is start taking amino acids from its own tissues. And one of the first places it likes to go for a rich source of amino acids is in the joint cartilage. And so you can already guess what's going to happen if you're protein deficient and your body starts pulling amino acids out of your cartilage. Eventually, what happens is that degeneration starts to accelerate and becomes faster than regeneration. The joint cartilage starts to soften a bit, and then it starts to break down. And eventually, when that starts to break down, you get bone-on-bone contact, and of course, that's what we know as arthritis. It can start out as like stiff joints, especially in the mornings, and then it can eventually end up some joint pain, and then decrease in range of motion, and eventually when arthritis starts to develop. So in this is the absorption of protein is heavily dependent on stomach function. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but basically the stomach function and its production of stomach acid. That's critical in this process. Hormonal systems. So hormonal systems are critical as well, as the hormone systems, the endocrine system reacts to all forms of stress. There are 4 forms of stress. One is physical, there's mental, there's chemical, which is basically food, air, water, and how contaminated it is, more or less. It can be food sensitivities, environmental sensitivities, these sorts of things. And then the last one is thermal. Thermal is basically in your environment, the extreme temperature changes in your environment. So in the spring and fall, when the weather changes from hot to cold or cold to hot relatively quickly, you can get an increased stress load on the body. And one of the things I notice in these seasons is that one of the effects of excess stress hormones in the body is that it starts to loosen the ligaments at the ends of the spine, specifically at the base of the head, in the upper neck, and in the pelvis. And when this happens, when these ligaments start to loosen up, becomes instability. And so when these joints become unstable, then you start to sprain the joints, and then you start getting back pain and neck pain and these sorts of things. And so adrenal function can be a big component in chronic low back or chronic neck pain. So what stress specifically, right? We talked about the forms of stress. The stress gland in our bodies are the adrenal glands. And of course, adrenal function is paramount for peak performance. When you see some of the top athletes in the world performing in the top leagues and on the top teams in the world, their adrenal glands are very healthy. They have really good adrenal glands. Their bodies can really handle stress well. And therefore the intensity and stress of competition, number one, at a high level is important. Doing it in front of thousands of people watching is also a stressor. And then naturally, if it's the championship, it's the stressor. So there's all these stressors. And when you see somebody excel in these situations, their bodies can really tolerate stress. Now, in a typical athlete, an amateur athlete, I should say, for example, a runner, one thing that might present or might happen is that they might start getting symptoms at a specific mark along their run. For example, like at 12 kilometers, they say, oh, at 12 kilometers, my hip starts to hurt, my back starts to hurt, my knee, and my ankle starts to hurt, all on my right leg for some reason. And so that means that the body can handle a stress up to a certain point, and then the body starts to break down. Now, with decreased adrenal function, you can get a decrease in lipase function, which lipase is an enzyme that breaks down fat, and then your entire fat metabolism will slow down, which then leads to early exhaustion, early onset of shortness of breath. After the first few minutes of training, you're already feeling exhausted. And so it's very, in the beginning stages of activity, it's really inefficient. There are 3 types of hormones. There's glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and androgens. Cortisol is the big famous one. It's a double-edged sword. There's some good things about it and bad things about it. Positives, it increases protein metabolism, increases lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fats in the extremities for energy, and it increases glycogen in the liver, which is the storage form of glucose. Negatives for chronically high cortisol. Cortisol is produced when you're under stress, and especially under a lot of stress, then your cortisol levels really elevate, and cortisol becomes more catabolic than anabolic. Catabolic is when it's breaking down tissues, and anabolic is when it's building them up. And then it increases facial and trunk lipogenesis. Lipogenesis is basically buildup of fat, so you start to build up fat stores around your trunk and in your face. This is a typical cortisol pattern. A long-term cortisol pattern is the guy that has has a big waist, big stomach, a chunky face, and then skinny arms and legs. That's a typical cortisol pattern. Now, you also get a decrease in DHEA, which is a precursor to the testosterone and estrogen, progesterone, and also a decrease in aldosterone, and I'll get to that in a minute. So increased cortisol over time from chronic stress can lead to an overtraining syndrome. Yeah, an overtraining syndrome is when you can trigger it by training too much without enough recovery time, which is very important. And what that can lead to is a lack of motivation to train. It can lead to a decrease in performance, or even so much so that you get injured. It can even lead to injury. So hypersecretions of cortisol, you get all kinds of effects, from increase in adrenal cortex size to your insulin resistance. It inhibits the thyroid. It shrinks the thymus, which is an immune system gland. You get visceral weight gain and obesity, especially in the midsection. You get what's called a pregnenolone steal syndrome, which then affects your sex hormones, testosterone, and estrogen, progesterone, etc. You get premature cell death. Apoptosis is basically cell death. Mineral loss from bones and osteoporosis, because cortisol will inhibit osteoblastic activity. Osteoblasts are the cells that make bone, and so you get an inhibition of these cells. So degeneration becomes faster than regeneration once again, and you get a decrease in thickness of the gut lining, which then can lead to malabsorption syndromes. You get an HPA axis problem, which is the hypothalamus pituitary axis, adrenal axis, and that's basically the endocrine system. And then, of course, overtraining syndrome, which we just talked about. So aldosterone is basically a hormone that's produced by the adrenals, and its main job is to reabsorb or reuptake salt in the kidney. Now, one thing we know from physiology is that water follows salt. So wherever salt goes, water is going to follow. So if you have good aldosterone production, it's going to reuptake the salt, therefore reuptake water in the kidneys. And when you reuptake water in the kidneys, you're going to stay hydrated. If you get stressed, or if you have chronic stress, you're going to produce less aldosterone, and therefore you're going to lose more salt, and you're going to lose more water and become dehydrated. So what happens is that you can drink tons of water, but it's going to go right through you. You're just going to pee it all out. And so in that regard, it's important to put some Himalayan salt or sea salt in your water when you're drinking it, and that will, because you're losing so much salt, you got to replace it. So if you put a pinch of salt in your water, it can help you hold on to that water a bit longer. That's just a small tip. Now, androgens. DHEA is the precursor of testosterone and estrogen. It increases protein synthesis. And of course, when you increase cortisol, you get decreased DHEA and then decreased testosterone and estrogen. And here on the right, you can see in the diagram, the pregnenolone there, we talked about pregnenolone steal syndrome, normally gets converted into the testosterone and estrogens and DHEA. But when we're under stress, we need more cortisol production. Therefore, it sucks the pregnenolone out from producing these other hormones, and it basically shunts it all into the cortisol pathway. And so basically, when you're under chronic stress, you lose your testosterone, for example, and then you start having those symptoms, and then also in ladies, progesterone, which is the vitality hormone, you start losing that, and that can start to lead to estrogen dominance, and that's a whole other topic for another day. But the idea here is that your body wants to survive the stress more than it wants to reproduce. So therefore, it takes the pregnenolone and shunts it into the cortisol pathway. So this is where stress, especially in high intensity exercise, has to be balanced with low intensity exercise. And I'll get to that in a minute. Adrenaline and DHEA. So healthy athletes have basically lower resting adrenaline levels. High intensity training athletes, their resting levels become elevated, which then can of course lead to overtraining and basically increases the resting heart rate and can lead to amenorrhea, where you basically lose your menstrual cycle. Now, Roberts et al. Said chronically increased cortisol decreases testosterone and up to 47% reduction in sperm count. So this is significant, folks. This is where you really need balance. This is an issue in CrossFit, especially because CrossFit is basically all high intensity. And so this can be an issue with these types of athletes. Now, DHEA, two main factors decrease DHEA, and that's cortisol and insulin. Okay, so we got to control cortisol and insulin. We got to control our stress, and we got to control our sugar. And basically, if you can control your insulin levels, you solve a lot of problems, folks. You control your blood sugar, you maintain a steady blood sugar, and you don't have the spikes in insulin. You really can reduce a lot of issues and increase your body's efficiency and energy production significantly. So now, when you're looking at nutrition supplement therapy, there's a few things you got to check, or at least consider. One is absorption, and the other is HCL production in the stomach. Now, HCL in the stomach, protein digestion and mineral absorption are dependent on an acidic environment for maximal absorption. I talked about before, the breakdown of proteins in the stomach is important. Otherwise, you're not going to absorb your proteins. So in the stomach, the proteins are broken down into peptides. Peptides are basically groups of amino acids clumped together. Those are then pushed out of the stomach into the duodenum, into the small intestine, where the pancreatic enzymes from the pancreas break down the peptides into individual amino acids, and then the amino acids are absorbed in the small intestine. Now, if you have decreased hydrochloric acid, then of course you're not going to be able to break down those proteins, and you're also not going to be able to absorb those minerals of calcium, phosphorus, iron, and zinc. Now, the number one factor in decreasing your HCL production is stress. Of course, stress. The solution is apple cider vinegar plus water, 50-50 mix, maybe a tablespoon of each in a shot glass before you eat, or if you forget after you eat, or if you don't like apple cider vinegar or the taste disgusts you, you can take betaine HCl plus pepsin. These are capsules, and you just take a capsule before or if you forget after. Now, the other thing is small intestine absorption. L-glutamine is the number one fuel for your intestinal mucosa. It heals the microvilli and seals up the leaks. Yeah, if you have leaky gut syndrome, you may have heard of leaky gut syndrome. It's basically when the barrier, the intestinal wall barrier becomes degraded, and you start to get holes in it. And as food passes by, it passes through these holes, and when it passes through these holes, it enters the tissues of the intestine and then triggers an immune response, because it's seen as a foreign invader. So your body triggers an immune response, an immune reaction, which creates a lot of inflammation, and you get a lot of gut inflammation. And that is like the formula for destroying any athletic performance, is gut inflammation. So it's really important. Now, glutamine is normally produced in the muscles and distributed by blood. So, but if you're overtraining, you're going to produce less glutamine. Okay, glutamine happens to also be a precursor for human growth hormone. Human growth hormone we produce a lot of when we're younger, in our 20s, less so when we're in our 30s and 40s. Basically, it makes your body create lean mass and less fat and burn fat more efficiently. So, summaries. Now, first step, you want to improve your nutrient absorption, right? Better function equals better recovery. So, you want to improve your nutrient absorption. So you can do your apple cider vinegar mix with water, or you can take your betaine capsules before you eat. That's gonna dramatically increase your digestion. You're gonna feel a difference. You're not gonna have the hard stone in your stomach after you get done eating. It's gonna reduce bloating after you eat. Hydrochloric acid is also a huge disinfectant for our food and kills tons of bacteria. So then the bacteria don't get to pass through your stomach and start to grow in your intestines. You're going to have L-glutamine is a possible supplement as well. It's an amino acid that, of course, is the main fuel for the intestinal mucosa, and you're going to heal basically the intestinal lining and seal up those holes, those from the leaks. And within a week to 10 days, you're going to already feel a difference. You're going to feel a really nice feeling in your intestines and in your stomach after taking L-glutamine. Of course, then stress management through meditation, etc. Exercise, low intensity exercise to balance the high intensity exercise is important. That's how you're going to manage your stress. Now, the second step, you want to look at your hormones and cortisol control. take your B complex. B complex is huge. Basically, everybody could take a B complex and that will increase your energy production. There's also herbs, ginseng, rhodiola, and ashwagandha. These are adaptogens for your adrenal glands, and especially ashwagandha I've had really good experience with in basically calming the system down. It improves your ability to cope with stress. And it also happens to be a great adjunct to raising testosterone and decreasing the symptoms of testosterone deficiency, if you know what I mean. So decrease insulin levels through decreased carbohydrate, increased fat in the diet. So basically you can go low carb. That doesn't mean no carb. It just means low carb. Increase your good fats in your diet, maybe not a total ketogenic diet. And then you want to incorporate your low intensity training, which is basically 180 minus your age for your heart rate. This is 180 minus your age is your max, and then decrease by 10, and that's your range that you stay in, that you work out in. If you don't have a heart monitor, what you can do is basically it's jogging and being able to hold a conversation at the same time. If you're jogging so fast that you're gasping for air and you can't talk, that's too intense. So it's really low intensity. But if you do this, and I can tell you from personal experience, this really will increase your endurance performance overall, because it's going to build your body up to your capacity to cope with the high intensity stress when you push your body in the endurance event. So I used it to play soccer, and it was dramatically better than high intensity training and pushing myself, running and running and running. And when I ran slower, I ran faster on the field and more and longer. So third step, carbohydrate metabolism and insulin sensitivity you want to have a look at. That's again, B vitamins. Magnesium and manganese are important. Chromium is a very important mineral for insulin sensitivity. It increases your receptor sensitivity, and therefore you need less insulin for the uptake of blood sugar into the cells. One of the big things that happens in type 2 diabetes is you get a decreased receptor sensitivity, insulin sensitivity, and therefore the blood sugar stays high, and that's not good. So basically, if you increase your insulin sensitivity, you won't need as much, and you're not likely then to produce as much. So, and then the last step is inflammation. We didn't talk much about this, but you want to control inflammation and oxidative stress. That's what happens with intense workouts, whether it's long distance or short distance. And that, of course, is B vitamins, once again, zinc and magnesium, once again, EPA and DHEA. Those are components of basically fish oils, omega-3s. And then you have your ACEs, right? ACEs are your vitamins A, C, and E. They're the antioxidants, and they are the best ones to help control acute inflammation, along with EPA. So now these ACEs are also antioxidants, and they scavenge free radicals. We create a lot of free radicals. When we exercise, we create a lot of free radicals in phase 1 of liver detox. And in phase 2 of liver detox, it takes these free radicals and attaches them to these antioxidants, which then are released and excreted in the urine. So by taking these vitamins, it's very important to have lots of antioxidants around so that you can get rid of these free radicals, because free radicals are known to be carcinogenic and cause lots of oxidative stress and tissue breakdown and, well, a lot of not so good things. Okay, I want to thank you for your attention. It's been great being able to share my knowledge with you. And if you have any questions, you can find me on Facebook. I'm known as the Box Doc in Munich, or you can write me at my email, which is at boxdocmuc@gmail.com. All right. Thanks again for your attention, and I wish you luck in your future endeavors.